The blade is not clean. It never is. The axe is a butcher's tool, not a surgeon's. And on this cold, grey morning on Tower Green, it is being prepared for a girl of 16. Her name is Lady Jane Grey. She cannot see the block from her cell in the gentleman jailor's lodgings, but she can hear the hammering. Each blow of the mallet, driving stakes into the platform, echoes through the stone like a sickening heartbeat. The sound is swallowed by the thick, damp air of the Tower of London. It is a sound of finality. She tries to pray. The words of her Protestant faith a familiar shield, but the Latin chants of a Catholic priest from a nearby cell drift through the walls, a dissonant counterpoint to her terror. She is dressed in the same black gown she wore at her trial. The wool is fine, but it does nothing to stop the shivering that has taken hold of her slight frame. In her pocket, she clutches a small, handwritten book of prayers. Her fingers trace the indentations of the ink. She is blindfolded, not to spare her the sight of the crowd, but to guide her steps. She stumbles, her world reduced to the grip of the lieutenant's hand and the feel of rough, wet wood under her thin-soled shoes. The smell hits her first, the coppery tang of fresh sawdust, thrown down to soak up the blood. Beneath it, the older, more profound stench of mud, damp wool, and fear. The crowd is a muted, shadowy mass, their breath pluming in the February air. There is no jeering, only a collective, held-breath silence, broken by the caw of a raven. This is not a queen's execution. It is an elimination. And it all began just 9 days ago. 9 days that shattered a kingdom and sealed her fate. The news arrived not with a herald's trumpet, but with the whispered urgency of a conspiracy. It was July 1553. King Edward VI, the boy king, was dead. The air in Chelsea was thick with the scent of river mist and blooming roses. Jane Grey, a girl of 15, was studying Plato in a library. She was a prodigy, fluent in Greek and Latin, more comfortable with ancient texts than with courtly intrigues. Her world was one of ink and ideas. Then they came for her. The Duke of Northumberland, the most powerful man in England, and her own parents, the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk, descended upon the house. Their faces were masks of grim purpose. They informed her that the king was dead, and that he, in his final will, had disinherited his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, and named Jane his heir. She refused. It was a shocking, brave act of defiance. She knew the law. She knew Mary was the rightful heir. She argued, she pleaded, she called it treason. But she was a pawn in a game she never asked to play. The pressure was immense, a torrent of political reasoning, familial duty, and outright threats. She was told it was God's will. She was told it was for the good of the Protestant faith. She was told she had no choice. Finally, broken and weeping, she acquiesced. "If what you tell me is right," she said, her voice hollow, "I must bow to the will of God." The journey to the Tower to be proclaimed queen was not a triumph. It was a funeral procession in reverse. The barge moved sluggishly against the current. The water slapped against the hull. She could smell the foul, fishy breath of the Thames. As she stepped onto the damp stones of the Tower Wharf, the portcullis loomed above her like the jaws of a beast. She was not entering a palace. She was being sealed in a tomb. The proclamation of her reign was met with a silence more terrifying than any riot. The people of London were confused, suspicious. They did not know this girl. They knew Princess Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, the legitimate heir. The wind that day carried not cheers, but the rustle of uncertainty. Meanwhile, in the countryside, a storm was gathering. Mary, upon hearing of her disinheritance, did not weep or hide. She fled to her estates in East Anglia. She raised her banner. She declared herself the true queen. And the people, the commons, the nobles who secretly held to the old faith, began to flock to her. They saw not a usurper in Mary, but a wronged princess. Jane, in the Tower, was a prisoner of paper and politics. Mary, in the field, was a queen of flesh and blood, riding at the head of a growing army. Inside the Tower, Jane's 9-day reign was a bizarre pantomime of power. She held court. She signed documents, her signature Jane the Queen a fragile claim on a crumbling reality. She argued with Northumberland over a proposed crown for her husband, Guildford Dudley, refusing to make him king without Parliament's consent. It was a display of her stubborn, principled nature, a tragic glimpse of the ruler she might have been in a different life. The air in the council chamber was thick with the smell of tallow smoke and male ambition. The maps on the table showed not a unified kingdom, but a nation tearing itself in two. Then, the foundations collapsed. The navy defected to Mary. The treasury was empty. The council, those hard-faced men who had pushed her onto the throne, began to melt away into the night, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The final blow came when her own father, the Duke of Suffolk, publicly abandoned her cause, tearing down her banners from the walls of the tower. The sound of the silk ripping was the sound of her world ending. Northumberland, on the road to confront Mary, looked up at a sky that had turned against him. He was heard to cry out, "The people press to see us, but not one says, 'God speed ye.'" He knew then it was over. He surrendered. The power that had seemed so solid, so unassailable just days before, had evaporated like mist. On the 9th day, the door to Jane's chambers opened. It was not a servant with her meal. It was her parents. They fell to their knees before her. They were not paying homage to a queen. They were begging forgiveness from a daughter. "Your Grace should put off your royal robes and be content with a private life," her mother said, her voice trembling. The reign of Queen Jane was over. It had lasted 9 days. The true queen was coming to London, and her name was Mary. The guards who entered next were not her protectors. They were her jailers. They escorted her from the royal apartments to the gentleman jailers' lodgings. The room was smaller, darker. The air was colder. The window looked out not on the river, but onto the inner ward of the tower. She was now a state prisoner, a usurper. The slam of the heavy oak door was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Outside, the city erupted in celebration for Queen Mary. Bells pealed, wine flowed, bonfires lit up the night. But inside that small room, Jane Grey sat alone. The scent of roses was gone, replaced by the smell of cold stone and her own despair. She was 16 years old, and she was going to die for a crown she never wanted. The celebrations for Queen Mary's accession were a distant, mocking roar. Inside the tower, Jane's world had shrunk to a single, stone-walled room. The air was stale, carrying the faint, ever-present odor of damp rot and the tallow smoke from a single, guttering candle. She could hear the tramp of the guards' boots outside her door, a constant reminder that her life was no longer her own. She was a problem, a living, breathing complication to the new queen's secure reign. For a time, however, hope flickered. Mary Tudor, initially, was inclined to mercy. Jane was, after all, a pawn, a young girl manipulated by powerful, ambitious men. Her own father had betrayed her. In the eyes of the law, she was guilty of high treason, a crime punishable only by death. But Mary saw a cousin, a misguided and brilliant child. She was kept in the tower, but not in a dungeon. She was allowed books, paper, ink. She corresponded with Mary's own chaplain, a learned man, debating the intricate points of theology that had torn Christendom in two. Jane held firm to her Protestant faith, a quiet, intellectual defiance. She was not contrite for her faith, only for the crown she had worn. This fragile stalemate lasted for months. The seasons turned. The damp chill of the tower's winter gave way to the brief, green hope of spring, and then to the oppressive heat of a London summer. Jane could hear the world moving on without her. The sounds of construction, of carts, of life. She was a ghost in the machine of the state, waiting for a pardon that never came. The hammer blow fell with the sound of a key turning in a heavy lock. It was the autumn of 1553. A new prisoner was brought to the tower, Thomas Wyatt the Younger, a fiery Protestant nobleman. And he was not coming alone. He was the spark to a powder keg. His rebellion, Wyatt's rebellion, was not in Jane's name. but its aim was to dethrone Mary and prevent her marriage to the Spanish prince, Philip, a marriage that would cement England's return to the Catholic fold and place the country under the shadow of the Spanish Empire. The rebellion failed. The ringleaders were captured, and in the dark, paranoid corridors of power, a chilling calculation was made. Jane Grey was no longer just a misguided girl. She was a symbol, a figurehead. As long as she lived, she would be a beacon for every Protestant plot, every disaffected noble who wished to see a different monarch on the throne. Her very existence was a threat to Queen Mary's security and to the Spanish alliance. The decision was made in whispered councils, in rooms heavy with the scent of beeswax and fear. King Philip of Spain, it was said, insisted upon it. He would not set foot in a country where a rival claimant still drew breath. Mercy was a luxury the crown could no longer afford. The news was delivered to Jane by the Tower's constable. His face was grim, his words carefully chosen. She was to be tried for high treason. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. She stood before her judges, a slight figure in black, and pleaded guilty. She knew the game was over. The sentence was passed. She was to be burned alive on Tower Hill or beheaded as the Queen pleases. She received the words with a terrifying calm. "The sentence is just," she was reported to have said. Her faith now was her only armor. She believed she was dying for God's true church, a martyr in the making. Yet, even then, a reprieve seemed possible. Mary, wrestling with her conscience, offered Jane a way out. A pardon, a chance to live a quiet, private life. There was one, simple, impossible condition. She must convert to Catholicism. It was the final, cruelest trap. To live, she would have to betray the very core of her being, the faith that had given her strength in the darkness. She refused. Her refusal was not a scream of defiance, but a quiet, unwavering statement of belief. She chose the axe. In doing so, she sealed her fate and transformed herself from a political prisoner into a Protestant saint. The date was set. February 12th, 1554. The night before the execution, Jane wrote her final letters. The scratch of her quill was the only sound in the deathly quiet of her cell. She wrote to her father, a man now also condemned, forgiving him. She wrote a poignant inscription in her prayer book, a final, elegant testament to her learning and her faith. As the dark hours wore on, she could see, from her narrow window, the carpenters building the scaffold by torchlight. The sight, she confessed to her guardian, was a great shock. The reality of the morning was now undeniable, a physical structure waiting for her. Dawn came, grey and unforgiving. She dressed carefully in the same black gown from her trial. She tied a blindfold herself, a small act of control in her final moments. When the lieutenant of the Tower came for her, she was composed, her prayer book clutched in her hand. She walked out onto the green, the blindfold sparing her the sight of the eager, pitying, horrified faces of the crowd. She ascended the steps, the rough wood catching on her dress. The air was biting cold. She could hear the murmur of the crowd, the shuffling of feet, the nervous coughs. She was guided to the block. She knelt. And then, her composure broke for a single, human moment. Her hands, fumbling in the darkness, could not find the block. "What shall I do?" she cried out, her voice small and lost. "Where is it?" The stones of the Tower of London have witnessed countless deaths, but few cling to the atmosphere as persistently as Jane Grey's. Visitors to the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula often report a feeling of profound sadness near the altar under which she is believed to lie. Some speak of a cold spot, a sudden, inexplicable chill in the air. Others claim to have seen the faint, fleeting apparition of a young girl in a dark dress, holding a book. It is just a story, of course, a ghost story born from a national trauma. But it speaks to the unsettling truth that some deaths are not an end. The axe that fell on that February morning did more than sever a head from its body. It created an echo of a life cut short, of a promise unfulfilled, of a question that can never truly be answered. It is the echo of a prayer whispered into the cold air, a final, quiet act of defiance that would resonate for centuries. What if she had simply said yes? The echo of that single, brutal chop did not fade. It reverberated through the stone corridors of the tower, through the cobbled streets of London, and down the long, unspooling corridor of English history. In the immediate, blood-soaked aftermath, the world moved on with a grim, mechanical inevitability. The sawdust was swept away. The platform was dismantled. The crowd dispersed, their whispers carrying the tale back to every corner of the city. But a stain remained, not just on the stones of Tower Green, but on the soul of the monarch who had ordered it. Queen Mary Tudor had intended the execution to be a surgical strike, the removal of a political problem, a necessary, if regrettable, act of statecraft to secure her throne and her impending marriage to Prince Philip of Spain. But she had grievously miscalculated. She had killed not a rival queen, but a girl. A brilliant, pious, and strikingly brave girl. The public sympathy that had once been hers for the taking as the wronged princess now curdled, shifting to the ghost of the cousin she had beheaded. The scent of wood smoke from the celebratory bonfires for her accession had long since dissipated, replaced by a new, more ominous smell carried on the wind from Smithfield, the smell of burning human flesh. Mary's reign descended into a 5-year-long nightmare, forever branded in the history books as Bloody Mary. The death of Jane Grey was the green light, the precedent that made all that followed possible. If a royal cousin, a girl of 16, could be killed for her faith and her bloodline, then what protection did a common farmer or a clothmaker have? The fires of the Protestant martyrs were lit, their screams a ghastly chorus that seemed to chant Jane's name. Each pyre was a monument to Mary's fear, and each one drove the people further from her. Her Spanish marriage proved deeply unpopular, a yoke of foreign influence. Her phantom pregnancies brought only mockery and despair. She died in 1558, lonely, embittered, and utterly failed in her life's mission, leaving a country more Protestant and more unified in its hatred of her than ever before. And her successor, her half-sister Elizabeth, learned from Jane's death the most critical lesson of all: survival. Elizabeth had herself been a prisoner in the Tower, walking the same paths Jane had walked to the scaffold. She knew how thin the line was between the royal apartments and the executioner's block. When she became queen, her rule was defined by a brilliant, calculating caution. She avoided marriage, knowing it could create a rival faction. She tolerated a degree of religious ambiguity, refusing to make windows into men's souls. She executed her own cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, but only after decades of delay and under immense political pressure. The ghost of Jane Grey, the innocent pawn, was a constant spectre at Elizabeth's court, a reminder of the price of weakness, of faction, and of reckless ambition. The debate among historians is a quiet, persistent hum in the background of Jane's story. Was she merely a passive victim, a virtuous hostage as the Victorian narrative loved to paint her? Or was there a spark of agency in her? Her initial, fierce refusal of the crown suggests a mind that understood power and its perils. Her later defiance in refusing to make Guildford a king hints at a nascent political will. Perhaps the truth is that she was both a pawn who, for 9 days, was forced to play the queen, and in doing so, discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. Her crime was not ambition, but conviction. She died not for a crown she coveted, but for a faith she refused to renounce. That refusal transformed her from a political casualty into a Protestant martyr, a symbol far more dangerous to Mary than a living claimant could ever have been. Her legacy is not found in laws passed or battles won, for she had no time for any of that. It is found in the enduring power of her story. In the centuries that followed, she became a canvas upon which each generation projected its own ideals. To the Victorians, she was the perfect, tragic maiden, pious and scholarly. In paintings, she is often depicted pale and beautiful, a book in her hand, her gaze turned heavenward. Her story was a moral fable about the corruption of power and the purity of sacrifice. Even now, her presence is felt. In the Tower of London, tour guides lower their voices when they point to the bare patch of ground on Tower Green. Visitors to the Chapel of St. Peter at Vincula stand in solemn silence before the plaque that marks the approximate resting place of the 9-day Queen. Some report a sudden, inexplicable chill in the air, a feeling of profound sorrow that seems to cling to the ancient stones. It is a ghost story, yes, but one born from a deep, historical wound. The air in that place feels different. It feels heavy. It feels watched. The final, unsettling truth of Lady Jane Grey is not that she died, but that she had to. Her death was a logical, almost inevitable conclusion to the brutal dynastic politics of the Tudor court. She was a piece on the chessboard, and she was sacrificed to protect the king. Her story forces us to confront the cold mechanics of power, where the lives of the young and the innocent are currency. It shows us how quickly the wheel of fortune can turn, elevating a bookish girl from a country house to a throne, and then to a scaffold, all in the space of a few heartbeats. And so, the echo persists. It is in the quiet rustle of pages in a history book. It is in the hushed tones of tourists standing on a patch of London grass. It is in the lingering question that her short, bright life leaves behind, a question about faith, about power, about the cost of conviction. What if she had simply said yes?